It was one of those calm Saturday mornings that felt almost too perfect to disturb. The neighborhood was washed in soft sunlight, the air carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass, and the rhythmic chirp of birds made it all feel like a scene from a postcard. Across the street, the neat rows of identical houses stood like soldiers on parade, a testament to the rigid HOA rules everyone here had learned to live with. Everyone, that is, except for one woman. At the far end of the cul-de-sac lived a neighbor everyone simply referred to as Karen. No one could remember her real name, and maybe no one cared to. She had a way of inserting herself into other people's business with the precision of a hawk diving for prey. Lawn too long? Karen would send an email to the HOA board before breakfast. Trash bins not pulled in by 8:01 a.m.? She'd have photographic evidence. It wasn't just pettiness, it was a personal mission. I had been on her radar for a while, but things had been quiet. Until that morning. Max, my 3-year-old golden retriever, was lounging in the backyard. He was gentle, friendly, and endlessly curious, but he had one habit he just couldn't shake: barking at squirrels. It wasn't aggressive, just a cheerful burst of sound whenever one darted along the fence line. Most neighbors thought it was cute. Karen did not. It started with a single bark, then another, and another. Max had spotted a squirrel making the daring trip from one tree branch to the next. I was inside, sipping coffee and flipping through the local news, when I noticed him pacing along the fence, tail wagging like a metronome. I didn't think much of it. Not until I caught movement through the blinds. Karen was standing at the edge of her yard, arms crossed, glaring directly at my house as if Max's barks were personal insults aimed at her. Her lips were moving, though I couldn't hear the words. She looked like a kettle just before the boil. The barking continued for maybe 5 minutes. That's when she stormed off. I figured she was heading inside to escape the noise. Instead, she came back out moments later, phone in hand, her voice carrying across the still morning air. She wasn't calling a friend. She was calling the police. I could hear snippets: disturbance, out of control animal, threat to safety. She paced back and forth like a lawyer preparing her opening statement. Max, oblivious to the storm brewing, kept watching the tree. At first, I thought it was just another one of Karen's empty threats, a scare tactic she used to get her way. But then, 10 minutes later, the distinct sound of tires crunching over gravel reached my ears. A police cruiser slowed as it turned into our street, lights flashing in the sunlight but sirens mercifully off. 2 officers stepped out, calm, collected, and scanning the area. Karen waved them over, launching into a rapid-fire explanation, gesturing wildly at my yard, then at Max, then back at me through my living room window. I stepped outside, coffee mug still in hand, and approached the fence, expecting a simple conversation. Maybe even a quick laugh when they realized what was going on. But there was something about the way Karen kept lowering her voice when the officers asked questions, the way she shifted her stance nervously, glancing toward her own house. The officers began walking toward my side of the yard, one of them making a note in a small pad. But before they could reach me, one officer stopped abruptly, looking down at something on the ground near Karen's property line. He crouched, examined it closely, and called his partner over. Karen froze. Her face went pale, and for the first time that morning, she stopped talking. Whatever they had just found seemed to change the tone of the entire visit. The officer's questions to her became sharper, more deliberate. Her arms, once crossed in authority, now hung stiffly at her sides. She kept glancing at me, but not with the smugness she'd arrived with. And then, without warning, one of the officers reached for his radio. What had started as a petty complaint about my dog was shifting into something entirely different. And for the first time, it looked like Karen might not be the one in control. The quiet, controlled energy of the street shifted the moment the officers spotted something by Karen's property line. What had begun as a complaint about a noisy, dangerous dog now felt like the opening scene of an entirely different investigation. Karen's body language changed instantly. She had arrived at the curb with the confidence of someone who expected the law to be on her side. But now her posture seemed smaller, less assured. Her hands fidgeted at her sides, Her eyes darted between the officers and the item on the ground. From where I stood, I couldn't make out what it was, but I could see the way the taller officer crouched, his gloved hand brushing the dirt around it before picking it up carefully. The smaller officer began making quick notes, then stepped away to speak into his shoulder radio. Their voices were low, and even though I strained to hear, all I could catch was the clipped efficiency of police jargon. Karen tried to regain her footing, leaning toward the officers and gesturing at my yard again, but they didn't look at Max or at me. Their focus was entirely on her now. The taller officer asked her something. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see her hesitation before she answered. The hesitation was telling. A few of my neighbors had begun to take notice. Curtains shifted. Front doors cracked open just enough for a pair of eyes to peek out. In a neighborhood like ours, even the smallest disruption drew attention, and this was shaping up to be the kind of story people would repeat for months. One of the officers walked up my driveway toward me. His expression was calm but serious, the kind of face that told me this wasn't about a barking dog anymore. He asked a few questions. How long Max had been outside, if I'd heard or seen anything unusual in the last hour, if I knew whether Karen had visitors earlier. I answered honestly, still confused about the direction this was taking. Meanwhile, Karen's voice rose just enough for me to hear fragments of her protests. She kept insisting that the barking was the problem, and that I wasn't a responsible pet owner. But the officers weren't taking her bait. They were methodical, deliberate, and, from the way Karen's face tightened, clearly pressing on something she didn't want to discuss. I noticed one of the officers looking at Karen's front porch. It was cluttered, far more than usual. Old boxes, a broken chair, and what looked like a black garbage bag slumped against the railing. It wasn't uncommon for her to leave things out for days, but something about the officer's focus made me think this mess was more significant than an eyesore. Then came the moment that made the whole street collectively lean in. The shorter officer returned from the patrol car carrying what looked like a small evidence kit. He knelt again where they had found that mysterious object and began dusting it carefully. Even from my distance, I could see Karen's breathing change. Her shoulders rose and fell faster, and her stance widened as if bracing herself. It was subtle, but there was no mistaking the shift. This was no longer a noise complaint. This was an investigation, and Karen was no longer the accuser. She was becoming the subject. Max, still in the backyard, had gone quiet. He seemed to sense the tension. His tail held low as he watched through the slats of the fence. For a moment, I wished I could bring him inside, shield him from the strange undercurrent running through the air, but I didn't want to miss what was unfolding. The taller officer stepped closer to Karen, speaking in a firm, even tone. Her replies became shorter, less confident. The neighbors watching from their porches were leaning forward now, the invisible network of neighborhood gossip already forming its first lines. And then it happened. The smaller officer, still wearing gloves, held up a clear evidence bag. Inside was something metallic, small but heavy-looking. Whatever it was, it seemed to draw the last bit of color from Karen's face. The officers exchanged a look. One of them stepped back toward the patrol car. The other began speaking into his radio again, this time with a clear urgency. Karen's protests grew louder, but instead of swaying the conversation, they seemed to harden the officer's resolve. It was like watching a slow, careful shift in power, from Karen being the one making demands to Karen being the one answering to authority. Then, the taller officer motioned toward her house. First, she shook her head. Then she took a reluctant step toward the front porch. The officers followed, one slightly ahead, the other hanging back as if to keep the space between them controlled. The sight was surreal. The same woman who had stormed out moments earlier to confront me was now being guided toward her own doorway by two officers who weren't there to take her side. I stood still, coffee growing cold in my hand, as I realized the barking had only been the spark. Something far larger, far stranger, was about to be uncovered. And judging from the look on Karen's face, she knew exactly what it was. The moment Karen stepped toward her front porch, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The slow, deliberate way the officers followed her gave the scene an almost cinematic weight. One walked just behind her, his eyes scanning every movement. The other hung back a few paces, glancing occasionally toward the neighbors who had started to gather on their lawns. From where I stood, I could see the layers of disarray on her porch more clearly now. Piles of mismatched items crowded the steps, warped cardboard boxes with faded shipping labels, a rusting bicycle frame, and a scattering of old magazines that had been bleached brittle by the sun. At the far corner, the black garbage bag I'd noticed earlier sagged under its own weight, something inside giving it a lumpy, uneven shape. Karen paused briefly at the top of the steps before unlocking her door. The motion was almost reluctant, as though she knew that once it opened, there would be no taking back what the officers might see. The taller officer entered first, his posture low and cautious, while the shorter officer remained outside for a moment, speaking into his radio again. Within seconds, a sharp, unpleasant odor drifted out into the street. Faint, but unmistakable. It was the kind of smell that made you instinctively pull back, the kind that told you whatever was inside had been there too long. One neighbor across the street, a man who rarely left his porch, shifted uncomfortably and went back inside his house. Others stayed, curiosity outweighing discomfort. From my spot at the fence, I couldn't see much past the doorway, but I could hear the shuffle of footsteps inside, the occasional metallic click of something being handled, and the low murmur of the officer's voice calling back to his partner. Karen stood near the entryway, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes fixed on the ground. Then came the sound of something being moved, heavy, scraping across the floor. The officer reappeared briefly at the doorway, his face unreadable, before disappearing back inside. The shorter officer finally entered as well, leaving the door wide open. From my angle, I caught a glimpse of a dimly lit living room. What little I could see was a chaotic tangle of stacked furniture, boxes, and stray belongings, like a thrift store that had been ransacked and never put back in order. The air inside looked thick, as if years of dust had settled into every surface. Another smell began to mix with the first, not just stale air, but something sharper, something that hinted at rot. My stomach turned, and I found myself taking a step back without even thinking about it. The minutes stretched. Every so often, the officers' voices would rise just enough for the street to hear the urgency in them, even if the words were indistinct. At one point, a loud crash echoed out, followed by a pause so long that even Max, still watching from the backyard, seemed frozen. And then the taller officer emerged. In one hand, he carried another clear evidence bag, but this one was larger, filled with several smaller items, each individually wrapped. They glinted faintly in the sunlight, metallic and strangely uniform. He handed them to his partner before stepping aside and speaking into his radio yet again, the tone clipped and precise. Karen's face had drained of all color. She stood stiffly, her jaw clenched, as if holding back words she knew would only make things worse. It wasn't long before another patrol car pulled up, followed by a white SUV marked with a seal that suggested a different branch of law enforcement. Two more uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes immediately scanning Karen's property before heading toward the open door. The exchange between the first officers and the newcomers was brief but purposeful. Whatever had been found inside her home had elevated the situation to something far beyond a neighborhood dispute. The second pair of officers entered the house, and within moments, a muffled exclamation carried out into the street. It was the kind of reaction you didn't hear over something minor. They stayed inside longer this time, methodically working their way through the interior. Occasionally, one would reappear at the doorway to pass another evidence bag outside. Each item seemed to tighten the tension in the air, though no one yet knew exactly what they were. Karen stood rooted to the spot, glancing around as if searching for someone, anyone, to side with her. But the street had turned against her in silence. The same neighbors she had reported for lawn violations, trash placement, and fence paint colors now watched her without sympathy. When the officers finally stepped back out, they spoke quietly to each other, their expressions grim. One nodded toward Karen, and the other moved in her direction. I realized in that moment that her morning plan had been simple: to make trouble for me over a barking dog. But the thing about digging for dirt is that sometimes you uncover more than you can handle. As the taller officer reached for something at his belt, Karen took a single step backward, her heel brushing the edge of her porch. The movement was small, but it carried a sense of finality, as though she knew the next step in this process wouldn't be hers to choose. And just as the street's attention reached its peak, the taller officer spoke into his radio one more time, a short, unmistakable code. Whatever happened next would no longer be about a neighborly annoyance. It was now a full-blown criminal investigation. The tension that had been building since the first police cruiser arrived was about to break. The taller officer's radio call had been short, almost casual in tone, but the effect was immediate. From the corner of the street, another patrol vehicle rolled in, followed by an unmarked sedan with tinted windows. Both parked strategically, one blocking the narrow cul-de-sac exit, the other idling directly in front of Karen's house. Karen, still standing on her porch, seemed caught between indignation and disbelief. She kept glancing at the growing number of uniforms gathering near her property, her eyes flicking from face to face as though searching for someone who might still see her as the victim she'd been claiming to be all morning. But that illusion was crumbling fast. The new arrivals stepped out with quiet precision. Their demeanor was different from the first responding officers, more deliberate, more focused. They carried themselves like people who weren't here to mediate an argument between neighbors. They were here to end something. One of them approached the taller officer, who gestured toward the open door of Karen's home. A brief exchange followed, their heads tilted toward each other, expressions grave. The newcomer nodded, then turned to look directly at Karen. She straightened her posture in response, trying to summon the authority she wielded so easily in HOA meetings and street confrontations. It didn't work. The officer began walking toward her in that steady, measured pace that seemed to shrink the space between them without ever looking rushed. The other officers fanned out subtly, positioning themselves in a way that made retreat impossible without being obvious about it. By now, the neighborhood had fully committed to the spectacle. A cluster of residents stood on the sidewalk opposite Karen's house, phones in hand, careful to keep just far enough away to avoid interference. The air was electric with curiosity, and with the unspoken satisfaction of seeing the neighborhood's most notorious troublemaker finally face consequences. The lead officer stopped at the base of Karen's steps. There was a pause, not long but long enough for everyone to feel the shift in power become absolute. Then, in a smooth, unhurried motion, his hand moved toward his belt. The metallic click of handcuffs locking into place was almost lost in the ambient noise of the street, but the image was unmistakable. 1 second, Karen stood with her arms crossed in defiance. The next, her wrists were being guided firmly behind her back. The murmurs from the watching neighbors swelled, though no one dared raise their voice. The officer's movements were calm, professional, but the message was clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that would be resolved with a warning. This was an arrest. Karen's face flushed red, then drained to pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. She tried to speak, but the officer at her side maintained a steady, quiet stream of words that seemed to direct her attention forward. Slowly, they began walking her down the steps. Each footfall echoed across the street, magnified by the fact that every eye was fixed on her. Max, still behind the fence, let out a single bark, sharp and sudden, as if punctuating the moment. A few of the neighbors exchanged knowing glances. When they reached the patrol car, Karen hesitated, looking over her shoulder toward her house. Perhaps she thought she could still salvage the situation somehow. But one of the other officers stepped forward, gently but firmly guiding her into the back seat. The door closed with a solid, final sound that seemed to mark the point of no return. While Karen sat inside the vehicle, 2 officers returned to her house. They moved with purpose, each carrying additional evidence bags. One of them paused briefly at the black garbage bag on the porch before carefully lifting it into a larger container. Whatever was inside seemed to have weight, both physical and, judging from their caution, legal. The officer from the unmarked sedan stood apart from the rest, speaking into a phone. His gaze swept over the street, the onlookers, and finally toward me. It wasn't accusatory, but it lingered just long enough to make it clear that he was taking stock of who had been present from the start. The scene had shifted from petty neighborhood drama to something with far greater implications. And the irony was impossible to ignore. All of this had started because Karen had decided my dog's barking was a personal attack. Now she was in the back of a squad car, watching her own home become the center of an active investigation. Minutes later, the taller officer emerged from inside, carrying yet another evidence bag, this one smaller but sealed more tightly. He handed it to the man from the unmarked car, who tucked it carefully into a locked case. No one explained what it was, but the gravity in their movements suggested it wasn't something trivial. Finally, the lead officer returned to the patrol car where Karen waited. He opened the front passenger door, said something to the driver, and then climbed in himself. The car pulled away slowly, turning the corner and disappearing from view. The second patrol car remained, along with the unmarked sedan, both still stationed in front of Karen's house. The officers who stayed behind continued their methodical work, documenting, collecting, and photographing. The crowd of neighbors began to disperse, but the street buzzed with quiet chatter. No one knew exactly what Karen had done or what had been found inside her home, but everyone agreed on one thing. This wasn't the end of the story. From my own driveway, I watched as the officers sealed Karen's front door with a strip of official tape. Whatever secrets were inside would remain there for now, locked away under their authority. But as I turned to go inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just witnessed the beginning of something bigger, something that would soon pull the whole neighborhood into its orbit. The morning after the arrest, the neighborhood was restless. Curtains shifted more than usual, conversations between neighbors were cut short whenever someone passed by, and the street carried that strange weight that comes when people know something big has happened, but don't yet have the whole picture. Karen's house sat in eerie silence. The official tape across her front door fluttered gently in the breeze, a bright slash of authority against the weathered frame. No one went near it. Even the mailman, normally unfazed by dogs, sprinklers, and gossiping residents, gave the property a wide berth, dropping her mail at the curb instead of walking up the path. From my own porch, I could see the faint marks left in the dirt where officers had stood the day before, their boots having pressed neat, shallow impressions into the ground. The memory of Karen being led into the back of the squad car played over in my mind. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with a surreal sense of justice. But the unanswered question gnawed at everyone. What had they found? By midday, hints began to emerge. The unmarked sedan returned, this time without the patrol cars, and two plainclothes officers stepped out. They moved quietly, unlocking the front door and disappearing inside. Their presence alone suggested the matter hadn't been resolved overnight. A few hours later, I caught sight of them again, this time carrying more sealed evidence containers. They didn't look like the kind used for paperwork or household items. These were heavier, their contents shifting inside with a muted metallic sound. The men placed them carefully in the trunk of their vehicle, shut it with deliberate force, and left without a word. That's when I noticed something strange. Karen's side gate was also sealed. It wasn't just her house under investigation. Her backyard was part of it too. The lock on the gate had been replaced, a small numbered tag hanging from it like a badge of authority. Whatever had been happening inside her home extended beyond its walls. By the following day, the whispers began. One neighbor claimed to have overheard an officer mention illegal possession. Another swore they'd seen a photograph of the evidence. Small, numbered metal parts, some rusted, some newly polished. A third insisted it had something to do with stolen property from another county. I tried to piece the rumors together, but they contradicted each other too much to be reliable. Still, there was a common thread. The items found weren't ordinary. They were valuable to someone, dangerous to others, and enough to turn a simple barking dog complaint into a full-scale arrest. 2 days later, confirmation came in a way none of us expected. I was raking leaves in the front yard when another unmarked SUV rolled slowly into the street. This time, the logo on its side was unmistakable, a federal agency. Not local police, not county detectives. Higher than that, they parked in front of Karen's house, stepped out, and began photographing the exterior. One of them even took measurements along the porch, the yard, and the fence line. This wasn't about noise complaints or petty theft. This was evidence for a larger case. The agents spent hours inside. When they finally emerged, they were carrying a series of carefully sealed crates. Even from a distance, I could see the numbered seals on each one, the heavy-duty locks meant to prevent tampering. They loaded them into the SUV with quiet efficiency, their movements practiced and deliberate. By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance. No one spoke above a whisper, but the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone could feel the scope of the situation widening, and with it, the mystery deepening. Later that evening, one of my closer neighbors, the kind who always seemed to know someone in the right department, stopped by with the first real piece of information. According to her source, the items found in Karen's home were linked to a series of burglaries in the surrounding counties. Tools, rare collectibles, and even some antiques had gone missing over the past year. And some of those stolen goods were now sitting in evidence lockers because of what the officers found inside Karen's living room and porch. The revelation sent a shockwave through the neighborhood. Karen, the same woman who had filed complaint after complaint about others not following the rules, had apparently been harboring stolen property in plain sight. It wasn't clear whether she had stolen them herself or was holding them for someone else. But either way, possession of stolen goods, especially at that scale, was enough to warrant serious charges. And the black garbage bag on her porch? That was the most damning piece. Inside had been smaller valuables, watches, jewelry, and a collection of rare coins that matched the description from one of the largest thefts in the area. The metallic glint I'd seen through the evidence bag now made perfect, unsettling sense. It was almost poetic. The woman who had spent years weaponizing the HOA rules to keep the neighborhood in order had been living in violation of far bigger laws. But there was still one detail that didn't sit right with me. Why had she called the police in the first place if she knew she had all that in her house? Was it arrogance? Carelessness? Or had she been certain the barking was about to expose something she didn't want anyone to find? That last thought lingered, unsettling in its implications. Because if Max hadn't barked at the squirrels that morning, the officers never would have been called. And if they hadn't been called, they never would have found the stolen goods. Which meant Karen's own complaint had been the thing that unraveled her entire secret. Still, something told me the story wasn't finished. Stolen goods explained part of it, but not the federal involvement, not the sealed backyard, and not the way the agents had measured every inch of her property. Whatever the full truth was, it was bigger than stolen jewelry and antique tools. And I had a feeling we were about to find out. By the time the week ended, Karen's house had transformed from just another property on the cul-de-sac into a landmark of neighborhood infamy. The bright yellow tape was still stretched across her door, but now additional signs had been posted by the authorities, warnings that the premises were under investigation and that unauthorized entry was a federal offense. Most neighbors had resumed their routines on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of restless curiosity. People lingered a little longer by their mailboxes, walked their dogs in slower loops past the corner, and kept one ear tuned for the sound of another unmarked vehicle approaching. The whole street was suspended in a half-normal, half-watching state. The real shock came on a quiet Thursday morning. Another black SUV rolled in, but this time it wasn't just investigators. Alongside them was a small, heavy-duty truck bearing the markings of an environmental hazard unit. It parked right at Karen's curb, and the team that stepped out wasn't dressed in standard uniforms. They wore protective suits and gloves. The sight alone sent a ripple through the neighborhood. Environmental hazard units didn't get called out for stolen goods. They were for substances, contamination, or dangerous materials. And whatever they were here for, it was inside Karen's property. The crew moved quickly, unloading specialized equipment, portable containment units, sealed bins, and what looked like a compact air filtration system. They set up near the side gate, the one I'd noticed had been sealed earlier, and began the careful process of unlocking it. When the gate finally swung open, a faint smell drifted out. It was metallic and acrid, something that made the back of my throat tighten. Even from across the street, I could feel an instinctive urge to step back. The team didn't hesitate, though. They moved in with practiced precision, one carrying a portable scanner that beeped faintly as it swept over the yard. That's when it became clear. The backyard wasn't a normal backyard anymore. What should have been grass and hedges was instead a patchwork of uneven ground, with sections that looked freshly disturbed. In one corner sat a shed, its paint peeling and its door secured with an oversized lock. Two members of the hazard team went straight for the shed. They worked the lock loose, swung the door open, and paused, just long enough for the lead investigator to step inside first. A moment later, they emerged carrying a container, its sides marked with bright red warning symbols. Another followed, then another. Soon, a line of sealed containers was forming on Karen's driveway. The symbols on them were unmistakable. These weren't just hazardous materials. They were regulated chemicals, the kind not meant to be stored in residential areas without special permits. The pieces began to click together. Karen's arrest had started with stolen goods, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just that she had illegal property. She had been storing potentially dangerous substances less than 50 feet from children, pets, and families. Whispers spread quickly among the gathered neighbors. Some speculated she'd been part of an illegal trade operation. Others thought she'd been using the chemicals for some kind of unauthorized business. One person claimed they'd once seen her carrying sealed buckets into the shed late at night, but had assumed it was just paint or cleaning supplies. The truth, as it later emerged, was far stranger. According to the official statement released days later, Karen's home had been serving as an off-the-books storage site for stolen goods from multiple counties. Among those stolen items were industrial-grade chemicals taken from a warehouse during a break-in months earlier. The chemicals themselves weren't inherently explosive, but if stored improperly, as they had been in her shed, they could have caused severe harm to anyone nearby. The combination of theft, possession of hazardous materials, and the violation of multiple environmental safety laws had escalated her charges from a local matter to a federal case. And the most absurd part? None of it would have come to light if she hadn't decided to call the police on my dog. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Max, the same golden retriever who had sparked the chain of events by barking at a squirrel, had become something of a local hero. People who had never spoken to me before stopped on their walks to greet him, offering treats and pats on the head. Kids from 2 streets over came by just to see the dog who caught Karen. Life in the neighborhood slowly settled into a new rhythm. Karen's house remained under investigation for weeks, and rumors about what might happen to it swirled constantly. Foreclosure, auction, maybe even demolition if the contamination was too severe. No one knew for sure, and the authorities weren't rushing to say. For me, the whole ordeal was a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Relief that someone who had caused so much petty trouble for others was finally facing real consequences. Disbelief that such a web of criminal activity had been sitting right across the street, hidden behind a woman's obsession with controlling everyone else's business. The street felt different now. Without Karen's constant surveillance, people relaxed a little. Lawns weren't measured against HOA regulations quite as strictly, and kids could ride their bikes without being reported for unsafe behavior. The absence of her presence was as tangible as her presence had been before. Looking back, the chain of events felt almost impossible. A barking dog, a petty phone call, a routine police visit, and from there, the unraveling of a secret that spanned multiple counties, involved stolen goods, dangerous chemicals, and ultimately, federal charges. If there was one lesson the neighborhood took from it, it was this. Sometimes the smallest actions can expose the biggest lies. And sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with grand gestures. It shows up quietly, in the form of a squirrel running along a fence, and a golden retriever who just won't stop barking. 3.